Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar on unfair pricing practices. My name is Justin Stofferahn, and I'm the Anti-Monopoly Director for the Minnesota Farmers Union, which is a grassroots organization representing family farmers, ranchers, and rural communities across Minnesota. I want to thank the American Economic Liberties Project and Institute for Local Self-Reliance for co-sponsoring this event, as well as the National Grocers Association and Consumer Reports for their help as well. The challenge of affordability has dominated recent election cycles, and polling in Minnesota and nationwide underscore people are feeling the squeeze of our cost of living crisis. I will say that talking about high prices is somewhat tricky for a farm organization since farmers across the state are struggling with low prices for the goods they produce. Yet at the same time, we know consumers are seeing costs at the grocery store and beyond continue to rise. An underappreciated but core reason for rising costs are a range of anti-competitive tactics, some new, some old, being deployed in a highly consolidated economy. Today's webinar will explore some of those tactics and what state policymakers can do about it. Some quick housekeeping before we dive in. We're recording this webinar and we'll be posting it on our YouTube channel and potentially elsewhere, such as our website. You can submit questions using the Q&A feature. We'll respond to questions at the end of all of the presentations, with the exception of one presenter that I'll get to later. But do feel free to start entering your questions in the chat as we move along. If we're unable to get to your questions during the webinar, we'll make sure to follow up via email. Finally, I want to thank my colleague Lisa Holm at MFU for all her help organizing today's event behind the scenes. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Ron Knox from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance to kick us off with a discussion about price discrimination.
All right. Thank you, Justin. Appreciate being here. I am Ron Knox. I'm a senior researcher and a policy advocate at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. We are a Minneapolis-based research and advocacy organization that supports strong independent communities by opposing monopoly power and corporate concentration. I am indeed here to talk about price discrimination. I realize folks on the call probably have like a whole range of different levels of understanding and knowledge about price discrimination in the Robinson-Patman Act. So I'm going to start at a pretty basic level and go from there. I'll talk a little bit about the history of the law, the effects that we see today, and then I'll talk about what we can do about it. So when I talk about price discrimination, what I mean is the way that large, powerful corporations, like really dominant retailers like the Walmarts and the Amazons of the world, use their sheer size and power as a buyer of goods and services to really to bully everyone else in the retail economy, from like really big brands like Campbell Soup and PepsiCo to small manufacturers, and then especially the small Main Street stores with whom they compete. At ILSR, I work on the independent business team, so I have a lot of interaction with small retailers from around the country, and we hear stories with from small business owners who, despite providing a great service, great products, innovation in their industries, they simply cannot acquire the goods that they stock on their shelves at the same price as the big box chains. That's even when they buy their goods in the exact same quantity as the Walmarts of the world, right? Either on their own or through a wholesaler, co-op wholesaler, for example. A truckload is a truckload. There's no difference in efficiency when a truck is, backing up to a warehouse. But the mom and pop stores, the small stores, almost always have to pay more, and often far more, for the exact same goods. Why is this? It's because the big chain stores simply use their size and their power in their industries to say to suppliers, look, here's the price we're going to pay. If you don't like it, tough. If it cuts into your margins, tough. Go make up your margins somewhere else. But here's what we're paying. and here are the package like sizes that we want, for example, or here's the marketing and advertising budget that we want, um, and uh, and that's the bottom line. And if you don't say yes, then you're just not going to be on our shelves. And again, these are the most dominant retailers in the country. So if you're a supplier, you have a very, very hard time saying no or even, negotiating a different price. So then those suppliers, big and small, are forced to make up those margins by charging higher prices to the little guys, to the mom and pop shops, to the regional chains, all of those smaller players in the market. Those smaller retailers, then, their margins aren't great anyway. You go to like a mom and pop grocer, we're talking about 1-2% above costs is what they're charging folks, but they still have to charge more for what they sell to make that 1 or 2%. So even if they are providing a better service, better products, better expertise, all those things, they lose business because their price is going to be higher because of the systemic discrimination. And as we all know, especially in this economy, price is really the bottom line for a lot of consumers. So that leads to all kinds of problems that I'm going to talk about here in a second. But I'll say it was not always this way. This has not been the situation in the retail economy, um, over time. For many decades, a federal law called the Robinson-Patman Act helped ensure economic fairness in America and created a level playing field for both small and big businesses. This law was passed in 1936. It was the wake of the Great Depression. And it was also a time in our history when there was a rise of big supermarket chains. It didn't really exist in the economy before. So the A&Ps of the world, the Krogers of the world were really gaining power. And it became pretty clear after a Federal Trade Commission investigation that these big chains were using their size to really push around their suppliers, raising prices for the small and independent stores. So Congress took action. They passed this law, and they knew that lower prices to suppliers meant lower wages for workers, higher costs to mom and pop shop, all these other things. For from essentially then mid 30s through the 1970s, this law was enforced. And it was enforced vigorously, and it was enforced against both suppliers and retailers. And that enforcement worked to ensure a really diverse retail economy where you had small shops, you had regional chains, you had big chain stores, and they were all able to survive and thrive, as I say, because there was this fairness, there was this level playing field for all of these stores. And so what did that lead to? That led to really vibrant communities. There were no food deserts at the time. Essentially, food deserts are an invention of the 80s and the 90s, all the way up until today. Very few food deserts. Everybody had a local store they could go to. There were good jobs. There was a robust middle class, really, for much of the 20th century. So then what happened? Okay, so then about 4 or 5 decades ago, everything started to change, not just when it comes to antitrust law enforcement, but of course with labor law protections, regulation of industry overall, and so on. But in that same breath, the federal antitrust agencies stopped enforcing Robinson-Patman because there was this pervasive belief among policymakers and more conservative economists and others, that bigger really was better, and that the aim of the antitrust laws should not be fairness, which is what it was for the previous 5 or 6 decades, but what it should be was efficiency and scale. And so bigger was better, and consumer prices were all that mattered, and that those abuses, that kind of systemic discrimination in the economy, was no longer important, because if it allowed the biggest firms to get bigger, then that was going to be good for everybody. And if it hurts workers, if it hurts smaller stores, if it hurts small American, manufacturers, if it hurts small farmers, then so be it. So in that amount of time, there have been scant few cases under the Robinson-Patman Act at the federal level, like at all. In fact, until late in the Biden administration, the law hadn't been enforced one time in 20 years. Okay. So the result of that was a cratering small business economy, lack of access to the market for small manufacturers and for farmers, and the rapid unchecked growth of monopoly power throughout the retail economy, both on the retail side, on the store side, and among manufacturers. You saw the rise of your PepsiCos and your ConAgras and all of these massive conglomerates that were just getting bigger and bigger and merging with one another in order to try to have some kind of countervailing power against the Walmarts and the Krogers of the world. So, what are the effects? So, the effects of this lack of enforcement for the last 5 decades are threefold. The way that I think about it, one is higher prices. Yes, Walmart is whatever the low price king, whatever they want to say. But the fact is that the lack of enforcement of the Robinson-Patman Act that led to the shuttering of many, many thousands and thousands of small retailers around the country, it gave these bigger stores and these changed the pricing power that we've seen since the pandemic, that they've really flexed and they've really been able to raise prices with no repercussions, almost from their shoppers. So when we talk about high prices, and obviously it's the thing that's on everybody's mind right now, it's the thing that's on policymakers' mind right now, those higher prices come from the lack of competition that we see in the marketplace, and that lack of competition is directly attributable to the reluctance and the unwillingness to enforce the Robinson-Patman Act at the federal level. The other side of that coin is the rapid growth and expansion of food deserts and the lack of access to food for so many people around the country. When you don't have those stores, when those stores can't get the same prices as the big supermarket chains and they close, you end up with food deserts. And food deserts in the 50s and 60s were incredibly rare. The term didn't even exist. The term was an invention of the late 80s and 90s, when all of a sudden you had this kind of rapid closure of lots of different stores around the country, and all of a sudden people's access to fresh and healthy foods left along with it. So you get the higher prices and you get the food deserts by the exact same forces. This rampant price discrimination that puts small grocers out of business. And then, the third thing that we think a lot about is lack of access to markets for farmers and for small manufacturers. When you have multiple ways that you can enter an economy, with multiple ways that you can enter a market, that's what you want. That's the ideal thing. So if you're a small grower, you don't have to rely simply on the farmers markets or simply trying to cut a deal with a regional chain or with a bigger chain. You have lots of small retailers where you can go to sell the things that you grow and the things that you make. That's really what you want out of an economy. That's how an economy is really competitive and robust. So that's why the Fair Competition Act is so important. It essentially mirrors the Robinson-Patman Act by prohibiting this kind of price discrimination at the state level that puts small businesses and farmers at a deep and unfair disadvantage. And by having the state law on the books, the people of Minnesota can ensure that even if the federal enforcers don't want to punish this kind of price discrimination, which they by and large haven't for the last half century, state enforcers can take action to protect their economy at home. So that's the overview of RPA. Hope that was helpful. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ron. To build off that discussion, I'm excited to introduce Chris Jones from the National Grocers Association to talk about this issue a little more deeply, specifically in grocery. And I will note Chris has to leave a little bit early. And so if folks want to submit any questions while he's chatting, we'll take, or while he's presenting, we'll take a second after his presentation and try to answer some questions. Ron and I may also be able to answer questions if folks have something that comes up after he's left when we move to the broader Q&A. But with that, Chris.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you, Ron, for that good overview. My name is Chris Jones. I'm the head of government relations and counsel at NGA, the National Grocers Association. So all of our members are privately owned supermarkets, and then the wholesalers that service them. So that's anything from your single store mom and pop grocery store in rural Minnesota to larger regional chains. Examples include like Coburn's, Lunds and Byerly, even Cub, Kowalski's, those sorts of guys. All of them fit within the profile of NGA membership. Go to your next screen or your next slide, please. Sorry, these are the ones with animations. You can you can do the animations. There we go. Go back. Overall, we're around 50,000 Minnesota jobs, almost 500 stores, and 1.5% of Minnesota GDP, which is larger than the national average. The one misconception about independent grocers, we're actually highly efficient. We're backed by very large wholesalers that have tremendous scale, and the ability to purchase in bulk, and most of them are billions of dollars of sales per year. The independents are overwhelmingly in the inner cities and rural areas, and these are places where big boxes and larger chains ignore because, put simply, if you're a publicly traded company, investors demand a pretty strong return on capital when you invest in a new location. And rural towns, inner cities don't promise that same return on capital, so they're overlooked, and that's why the independents and their ability to compete in these places are so crucial, and they're also why our inability to compete relative to this problem that Ron just outlined is why we have food deserts both in the inner city and in rural towns. And as Ron mentioned, it is a tough business. Our data for the independent grocers are below the net margin national average. We're around 1.2% in 2024. We haven't ran the numbers on 2025, but I'm told that they've gone down even further. Might even be below 1%. You can go to the next slide. So I have this slide because it kind of gives you a sense of what we're up against in terms of the massive players that exist in the grocery sector. And one stands out above all else, and that is Walmart. So they're around 314 billion in sales in 2023. If you took all of the independent grocers, that's around 250 billion. So even if we all decided to get together and merge into one big entity, we still wouldn't touch Walmart's sales. And so this gives them what we think of as gatekeeper power. If you've been part of the debates on big tech, and we talk about internet gatekeepers like the Apple App Store or Amazon, on the internet, on e-commerce, we see Walmart as a gatekeeper to grocery shelves because they control 29% of all U.S. grocery sales. So if you're thinking about like large consumer packaged good companies or meat packers or whoever sells into the grocery channel, Walmart typically represents 20 to 30% of your domestic sales. But if you flip that around for Walmart, each of those suppliers are around a decimal percentage of your sales. So there's this bargaining asymmetry that exists that allows Walmart to use its muscle, its power to squeeze better terms out of suppliers that they are able to do at the exclusion of everyone else in the marketplace. So it allows them to create a moat and then, pretty much puts them in a position where they don't have to compete in a lot of ways for food products because they can just get the lowest price because they are just that strong. We actually know this is a problem, not just for the independent grocers who have been shut out of business over the years due to this buyer power of the large entities. If you go to the next slide, even the suppliers, you can go to the next slide. Even suppliers have a problem with this behavior in the marketplace. So if you're publicly traded, you have to take a dose of truth serum every year in your 10K statements to investors that the SEC requires for publicly listed companies, and almost all of them have this boilerplate language in their 10K, 10Q statements, and it talks about the fact that they sell to one large player in particular that allows them to squeeze better terms, and that's a material business risk for investors, for the large suppliers, because if you lose that one customer, you're in real trouble. And all of this, you can go to the next slide, we believe is attributable, this problem for independent grocers, problem for suppliers, problem for agriculture producers. All of this is attributable to the problem outlined by Ron. It's a failure to enforce the antitrust law that was contemplated for this exact problem in the economy. Dates back to the 1930s, a time when consumers were in real trouble because of the Great Depression. There was a large entrant, there was a large player, the great A&P, the Walmart of its time, pushing out smaller retailers. Congress said we need to do something about it. And so they passed a law that allows for a level playing field depending on the quantity you purchase. So it explicitly allows for quantity discounts. It also allows private actors, state AGs, and the Federal Trade Commission and the DOJ to enforce. But we have 40 years looking back at this experiment that we think was largely a failure. The belief at the time was that, oh, if we just ignore Robinson-Patman, then these large retailers squeezing suppliers are going to be pro-competitive and pro-consumer because they're necessarily going to pass on savings to the consumer, and that's good. Why would we want to enforce Robinson-Patman when we care so much about consumer welfare? But 40 years looking backwards, we have a lot of data and experience in the marketplace to know that this was an abject failure for three major reasons, which I'll outline at the end. Go to the next slide. But the main thing, like high level, that I want to emphasize is that this didn't create an incentive to pass on savings to consumers. Instead, it created an incentive to consolidate. And why do you want to consolidate as a grocer? Because you want enough buyer power and size and scale so that you can squeeze the marketplace to your benefit at the exclusion of everyone else. And we've had this really turbocharged in the last 25 years or so. There was a study in 2021 that had the top four retailers at 69% of sales. Two out of the four of those tried to merge. Why did they try to merge? Why did Kroger and Albertsons merge? Well, we found out at trial that they wanted to violate Robinson-Patman equally efficiently as Walmart does and squeeze for better terms. Our view is that's not how you fix the market. You fix the market through enforcement of the competition laws. And you can go to the next slide. So all of this has kind of what you would expect, the consequences we would foresee from these problems. So here's a really good example of a large it's not publicly traded, a large self-distributing retailer. This is a company with hundreds of stores. They also have their own warehouses, their own trucks, so they can go to the manufacturers and negotiate without having to use a middleman or a wholesaler. And so these are the KVIs, these products with high household penetration. You might recognize them on the left-hand side of your screen. These products are what they go and say, what is your best deal I can get on a truckload of product? And they've calculated the unit price even after you discount for promotional allowances, for all the different bells and whistles that you can get included in the cost of a good. And what you find is their wholesale cost is the right-hand column. Look at that relative to the retail pricing of the competition of Walmart. A huge delta between their own acquisition costs relative to Walmart's retail prices. How do you compete in this environment when you as a retailer get so big that you have your own trucks and warehouses, but you can't come close no matter what you do? You can't compete. You've got to find other ways to attract consumers into grocery stores. Go to the next page. So so we talked about food deserts. This is the number one reason for food deserts, but it's also, as Ron said, increasing prices for consumers. Because lo and behold, what happens when a retailer dominates a region? What they're able to do is simply increase prices on consumers, and we also know they're able to suppress wages because there are fewer places for workers to work. And there have been a few economic corroborations of this recently in the first empirical study that we've seen on the RPA that looked at alcohol laws. You had a control group. We were able to look at laws that had, stringent uniform pricing laws where the assumption is that's bad because they're uniform laws and they're in this competition at wholesale isn't vigorous. in law in states that are more the Wild West. And what you find is the states that have those uniform pricing laws, even though that's further than we would want to go, those states there is more consumer surplus simply because there is more retailers competing for consumer dollars. And we've also found there's an Atlanta Federal Reserve study that came out a few weeks ago showing that during inflation, the people that bear the highest burden of inflation are the ones who live in markets that are concentrated. And that translates into a lot of rural areas throughout the country. So we know food deserts are being created, and we know prices are going higher. And go to the next slide. And you can do one more click through the animation. This is another kind of consequence that you had price discrimination. This is what we call channel discrimination. This is really, I think, the problem for rural America that we're dealing with right now that the legislation aims to tackle, and that is packaging discrimination. So the kind of, example that we see and hear about all the time is you'll have like a small IGA grocer in a town of 2,500. And then the Dollar General will come in and they will decide to locate in either the same shopping center or across the street. And they go to the manufacturer and say, if you're going to do business with us, we need the same packaging, smaller package sizes, um, less product in the package. So during a time of inflation, there was just an article in the Financial Times about this. During a time of inflation, more and more consumers are crossing the street to go to that Dollar General because they're able to spread more dollars over more products. Prices are lower. Sometimes you're getting kind of duped because you think it's the same thing, but there's actually less product in it. And then what happens to that town? It's less healthy economically. If the grocery store goes down, all of the ancillary business tends to go down as well. If there's a hardware store, there's a bank, there's a restaurant, dry cleaner, there's no longer grocery foot traffic, all of those stores tend to domino effect. And then what happens in terms of the health of that community? All you have left then is the highly ultra processed foods that are offered at the Dollar General. Next page. So what does this mean? Number one, we talked about food deserts, higher prices. We talked about that. And then the last thing I think is really important for an agricultural state like Minnesota is this problem of food supply chain consolidation. So retail consolidation forces consolidation upstream because if you think about the scale and the buyer power of a large retailer, consumer packaged goods companies and meat packers, etc., have to accommodate that scale by bulking up themselves. And then they also aim to create their own sort of buyer power in the food economy. And that comes at the expense of the farmers and ranchers. And it's why you have a lot of frustrated farmers and ranchers out there who don't have competition for their goods, who many of them want to see Robinson-Patman as Justin has illustrated, they want to see Robinson-Patman enforced. They want to see price discrimination legislation so that we have a more robust grocery economy, more places to sell products. Next page. So this is just quickly on the Pricing Fairness Act. There are a number of states that currently have price discrimination laws. Actually, this is not all of them. This is only a handful. I missed a few in this slide. And then, states that have been considering the Consumer Grocery Pricing Fairness Act, Minnesota being one of them. New York has introduced a bill, Rhode Island, and Maine. Next page. So just a kind of quick rundown of what this bill does. It's meant to be very narrow in scope, address the problem only in grocery and food supply chain. And the idea is to prohibit both large retailer buyers from discriminating or for coercing discrimination, and then the large suppliers who are 6 billion in sales above from actually doing the discrimination. And it's very particular and specific as to what constitutes a violation. And there are very robust escapes for efficiency. So if you buy more product, you lower the cost of marginal cost of production to a manufacturer, you can get a lower price. That's great. But that lower price must be relative to the efficiency that bulk purchasing actually accounts for, not for the squeeze that the large retailer puts on you. So it's very narrow. It only touches the largest retailers and largest suppliers. And we have broad support from independent businesses, grocery, convenience, agriculture, are all aligned regarding the need for this sort of intervention. And I probably went a little over, but here's my email. I probably need to keep moving unless you think I have time for questions, Justin.
Yeah, well, thank you, Chris. I'll just quickly note that the legislation Chris is talking about here in Minnesota is House File 2149, Senate File 2556, and we'll put that in the chat at some point as well. We did have one question here, Chris, real quick, from Teresa. I don't know if you can see this, but smaller food co-ops don't have the volume to benefit from National Cooperative Grocers Association membership and price breaks, but as cooperatives, isn't there a fair expectation that bigger is not better and that size alone should not exclude a co-op from NCGA?
I'm afraid I can't answer that. We are not affiliated with the National Co-op Grocers Association, but I'll tell you all are welcome. NGA members, our main goal is advocacy, but we do a lot of education. We don't do really anything on the actual distribution of goods, but happy to talk with you, Teresa, if there's interest in the kind of services that we provide.
Thank you so much, Chris. Again, if folks have questions for Chris later on, we're happy to either try to answer those or send those along to Chris afterwards and follow up via email. So next, I'm honored to hand things over to Fordham Law Professor Zephyr Teachout. And while Zephyr will be discussing price gouging, I know when we get to Q&A, there might be insight you can share on all sorts of issues, given your broad expertise on today's overall topic. So really grateful to have you here. Zephyr, you can take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Justin, for having me and for organizing this. I'm going to focus on price gouging, and I am going to leave some time for questions. I think we have 8 to 10 minutes. Is that right? Okay, great. To talk about this and some other issues. So I see price gouging as one of the most significant economic, and I'm sorry, I don't have any slides. Significant economic justice issues that has really come to the fore in the last 5 years. And when we talk about price gouging, let me describe it as it's a broad incarnation as it exists in most states across the country. Price gouging laws were largely passed starting in the 70s through today. They're extremely popular. As I'll talk about a little bit more later, I don't think it's a coincidence that price gouging laws gained in popularity just as antitrust enforcement waned in its aggressiveness. So what we're talking about when we're talking about price gouging broadly, and then we can apply it to particular states, is when there is an abnormal shock to a market. Like the classic example you might think of is a snowstorm in northern Minnesota, and there is somebody selling snow blowers. There's a major snowstorm. You've got to get out of your driveway. And so they radically hike up the price of that snow blower because there is a real asymmetry in power and information, and there's a sudden need to actually get that snowblower. It's a necessity. And so people are basically forced to pay prices high above what a market price might normally be. And we can talk about what that means, but what they might normally pay because of this shock to the system. So that's the basic structure of what a gouging looks like. And what different states have done then is interpret it in different ways. In some states, gouging laws are kicked in, and this is true in Minnesota, when there's a declaration of an emergency. That can happen at the state level, or in some states, the gouging law kicks in anytime any local official announces an emergency. So these are kind of triggers to the price gouging law that are tied to an announcement, a declaration, a governmental recognition of an emergency, whether that be a pandemic or a snowstorm, a strike, or something else. What other states have done, and New York where I live has done is tied it not to a declaration of an emergency, but to a declaration or any other kind of abnormal market disruption. And that can either be defined, as it is in New York, to cover military actions, significant labor strikes, and then there's a broad catch-all for abnormal market disruptions. There's these triggers. Once this trigger is in place, then the question is whether the seller of a good or service hiked up their prices in an unfair or unconscionable way. And again, states have dealt with this in different ways. Some of them say, we're going to, anytime there's a price hike after this trigger, we're going to look at a number. So in a few states, any price hike after that trigger might be price gouging. And in other states, it's as high as 30% price hike. In Minnesota, I think it's 25%. Is that right? Is the current price hike. Other states say, no, just look at whether it's an unconscionable price hike, so they don't have a number attached to it. And in all states and in all instances, if that price hike was due to increased costs because the merchant or seller, in fact, it costs more to get that snowblower, so they're charging more because they themselves had to pay more. That's an absolute bar to any price gouging action. So I use the snowblower as an example because that's often what we think of when we think of price gouging. But as you see from the structure of the law that I've described, or the structure of the laws that I've described, the basic intuition is not only not limited to mom and pop retailers and small retailers. In the last 5 years, the kind of price gouging we've seen has mostly been 1, 2, or 3 levels up the supply chain. So because we've seen this massive concentration of power in meat, in grocery distributors, and pharmaceuticals, it is the distributors, what we think of as upstream, up the distribution chain, who have been using their power in emergencies to hike up prices. Some economists actually estimate that over half of the inflation in recent years, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, were driven by just markups, not because of increased costs, but because they could. So I'll take diapers as an example. The price of diapers shot up during COVID-19, and that price was not justified by costs. So we got to actually reshift our imagination. And I think this is hard, but important. It's important for enforcers. It's important for the public to reshift our imagination, to move away from the image of the gas station being the gouger or the grocery store being the gouger, and look instead at the distributors who are gouging both the public and the small mom and pop retail store that often get accused of gouging themselves. So I want to walk through a few more things and then talk about how I think Minnesota can improve its law, and then open it up for questions. So first, I want to explain why I think of antitrust and price gouging as connected. In fact, I often think of price gouging laws, if you think of price gouging laws, especially as connected to those upstream corporate actors, as the poor man's antitrust. Antitrust cases are critically important, but they're often long and hard to prove. And we stopped enforcing antitrust laws from the late 70s until 2020, and then we're now in a Trump era where the enforcers talk a big game but aren't enforcing the law, leading to massive consolidation, hundreds of thousands of mergers across the United States, and hundreds of thousands of mergers in areas that affect basic necessities of life and goods or services. And once you have that level of concentration, once you have 3, 5 players in a market, their ability to take advantage of COVID-19, a major military action like the Russian invasion of Ukraine, or a snowstorm, is so much greater, because they know if they hike prices, they don't even have to coordinate. They can all be winking and nodding and collectively hike their prices, like we saw in the diaper arena, because there's basically 2 players in diapers. And people who desperately need those basic goods, groceries, the diapers, the energy sources, oil and gas, really have no choice, because there's nowhere else to go, because that small club of distributors has basically built a moat around themselves, making it very hard for anybody else to enter the market, create competition, and bring those prices down. The other reason I think of it as poor man's antitrust is because the structure of price gouging lawsuits, when well designed, and I do have a particular fix that I think Minnesota should look at, when well designed, are actually much easier to enforce. And I'm not saying easy. I was involved in enforcement action when I worked at the New York AG's office against Tyson. That action is still ongoing, so that was an upstream action. But what you need to prove a prima facie case of price gouging is that the prices were here, there was a triggering event, and the prices went up here. And then if the seller can prove that the prices jumped because of costs, case done, go away. But that's a lot easier structure of a case than a lot of the sort of bigger antitrust cases. So while we, and I hope we do, collectively seek to actually have a much more open and fair market, using the kind of laws that Chris Jones was just talking about to actually allow for real decentralization in the grocery market, we need to be using these laws. So, okay, I see you coming back on, Justin, so I'll move quickly. A few more things before I talk about Minnesota's fixes. One is price gouging laws are incredibly popular. People have economists don't like them. They say, look, the market's going to fix itself. But I think that what we've seen is both that people have a strong intuition that it is unfair to ration necessary goods by ability to pay, which is one of the things that price gouging laws protect against, and that they see what these big conglomerates are doing in using their market power to hike up prices. They understand that windfall profits violate a basic norm. And what I found so extraordinary is basically every major publication in the country came out against Kamala Harris's plan for a federal price gouging law, and the public support for it didn't budge. Like no number of economists is going to tell people that you should have to pay 30% more for diapers because the big 2 can run the market during a COVID-19 emergency. So when it comes to Minnesota's law, there's some really good elements. Minnesota's law does explicitly, unlike some states, cover upstream supply chain investigations, the possibility of upstream investigations. And that's really important. Because again, I think, I've talked to a decent number of grocers and a lot of gas station owners, and they think they sort of experience the world as 2 sets of laws. Like, we get slammed for the price gouging law, and the big guys get away with it. So it's really important to shift our enforcement energies and our public energies towards the upstream gougers and away from the mom and pops who are often just passing on the gouging that's happening upstream. It has a nice broad definition about what is covered, what kind of vital and necessary goods are covered. That's great. But there's a few challenges with Minnesota's law. I'll just mention 2. One is that it does require, as I understand it, the governor's declaration of an emergency. And what that means is that it creates a kind of weird situation where instead of looking at whether objectively there's a disruption, you have a political actor making decisions about whether there's a disruption or not. And that then moves away from the sort of unfairness core of the law. And the second is that unlike the structure of the law in New York, which I think is one of the most powerful in the country, which creates a prima facie case if there's a big price increase, and then says, hey, distributor, show us your costs. The Minnesota law doesn't have that same prima facie case, which makes it harder to enforce. I think that's it for the for what I wanted to cover at the beginning. But I know when I've talked to some people, they often think of price gouging as like a secondary or two-bit solution. But what we see in the healthcare sector and so many different sectors is big actors using their market power to really exploit crises, which are now coming at a faster and faster clip, to bump up prices and to really drive the unaffordability crisis that we have right now. I'm happy to open it up for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Zephyr. And I think we'll also, if you're able to stick around, we'll wait and see if folks add them in the Q&A. We'll keep moving to our other presentations, and then we've got some time there at the end. And so folks, please do though. I know we've had a couple of questions put in the chat, but continue to add those. I'll just quickly note, Ron made mention of this, but there is a piece of legislation, the Fair Competition Act, which is House File 34, Senate File 2025. I may have that wrong, so I'll put all of this in the chat. But that covers both the price discrimination, adds Robinson-Patman language that Ron was talking about, but then also sort of models some of the things that Zephyr talked about could be changed about Minnesota's price gouging law. But with that, to keep us moving along, I am excited to now turn it over to Pat Garofalo from the American Economic Liberties Project to discuss the rise of algorithmic price fixing. Pat?
Thanks, Justin. And hey, everyone. Thanks so much to our friends at MFU for pulling this together. I'm Pat Garofalo, Director of State and Local Policy at the American Economic Liberties Project, an anti-monopoly research and advocacy organization that's based in Washington, D.C. A note, I have no relation to the former Republican House representative with whom I share a name. It's just a funny and random coincidence. So what is algorithmic price fixing? It's the use by sellers of third-party platforms which plug data from multiple market participants into an algorithm and share out common pricing recommendations, turning ostensible competitors in an industry into collaborators and enabling collusion without the market participants actually talking to or directly conspiring with each other. Instead, they all simply share their data and let the common platform that they all use set prices for them, knowing full well that no one else on the platform will undercut them, thus eliminating competition and lifting prices for everyone. A quick aside here, though I'm talking about prices today, this all can and does also happen with wages, and policies to address algorithmic price setting can also address algorithmic wage setting. So according to court cases and news reporting, there's algorithmic price setting occurring in, among others, the hotel industry, agriculture industry, nursing homes, airlines, the frozen potato market, and I'm not kidding about that, though I wish that I were, and in the most well-known example, rental housing, which I'm going to break down a bit more as I think it's the clearest example of the harms that these systems can cause. So in rental housing, corporate landlords are using third-party software sold by just a few corporations in order to set common rents across local markets. The most prominent seller of this software is known as RealPage, a name I hope at least some folks have heard before and seen in the news, but there are a few other players in select markets around the country. So landlords across a local housing market share their private data regarding their rental properties, including current rents, available square footage, vacancy levels. RealPage and others, such as Yardi, which is another major player in the industry, allegedly use that private data alongside publicly available data sets to recommend rent and occupancy levels that maximize, and this is important, not just the individual landlord's revenue, but revenue across all clients in the market. So the result is inflated rents, artificially constrained housing supply, and higher profits for corporate landlords and the third-party price setters alike. According to court documents in several cases, these algorithms explicitly advise landlords to hold some units off the market, creating artificial scarcity, as well as to maximize churn, i.e. displace renters, so that the rent for the unit in question can get pushed ever higher. As one of the creators of this software put it, quote, if you have idiots undervaluing, it costs the whole system, end quote. But that undervaluing that he derides is what we would call competition for renters. Again, the explicit point of this software is to not have competitors undercutting each other in the market. The Arizona Attorney General, in a lawsuit against RealPage, alleged that it alone is responsible for 12% and 13% rent increases in Phoenix and Tucson, respectively, while the Biden administration put the cost of algorithmic price setting at $3.8 billion in higher rent payments in 2023 alone. Now multiply that across all the other industries that I mentioned, and the potential effect of algorithmic price fixing is enormous. So it's easy to get caught up and talk about algorithms and AI, and it all sounds very fancy and intimidating, and that's exactly what these corporations want you to think and to be scared of getting into the details. But here's the core point. Algorithmic price setting is the smoke-filled back room moved from a restaurant to an online platform, and the result is the same. It's not about the specific inputs, whatever secret sauce they're using in the algorithm. It's about the collusive behavior the algorithm enables between market participants. And the genius of it is that those who use these systems can elude our current price fixing laws due to, again, a lack of direct communication between competitors. This is actually a real shortcoming in price fixing law, even in the absence of algorithmic price setting. To even get to discovery in a case, a price fixing case, judges usually want to see a smoking gun proving direct communication between competitors, which you probably don't have without getting to discovery, and which algorithmic systems obviate the need for entirely. So these systems, in addition to all the harms I listed above, make a bad price fixing enforcement situation much worse. That was all very grim, and I'm sorry, but there are a few things that policymakers can do to address these problems. About a dozen municipalities across the country, including Minneapolis, as well as the state of New York, have banned the use of collusive algorithms to set rent prices, making collusion between landlords via these tools illegal. That same idea could be applied to other markets. California this year tackled it in a different way, focusing on coercion, making it illegal for someone to use an algorithm to coerce a seller in a market into setting a particular price. Now, this approach may leave out some algorithmic price setting if the players can argue that they're not being coerced, but it also opens up avenues to other problematic tactics, such as potentially Amazon giving preference on its platform to sellers that adopt Amazon's preferred pricing. So there's the approach of just kind of straight up banning these tools in certain select industries, and then there's California's approach of focusing on the coercive effects on sellers of these tools. You can also directly reform price fixing law and change the process to change standards around burden of proof to make these cases easier to bring and to get into court. And that would, again, have the effect not only of helping address some of these algorithmic price setting tools, but of making our price fixing law more effective across the board. So it's early days, but we think we're seeing some positive effects from the actions that have already been taken in this area. Law firms have been warning landlords to ignore or turn off the price recommendation function on their management software because of the proliferation of cases and laws in rental housing industry. These warnings are also spreading to other industries. I mentioned at the top nursing homes. A couple of weeks ago, I saw a legal warning to nursing home operators saying that they need to be sure that they aren't colluding with their competitors via the pricing tools they're using, because that could open them up to legal vulnerabilities. So that's all really promising, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done, and we need the drumbeat to keep going and have more cities and more states adding new laws and to address these tactics. Minnesota would be an absolutely fantastic place to take the next step, and I'm very happy to help anyone who wants to get into it.
Thank you so much, Pat. We're going to move to our final presentation. There we go.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about surveillance pricing, and I know we've already had the really fruitful, and we've been talking for about an hour, so I will keep it short and sweet. I'm Grace Gedye. I'm a policy analyst at Consumer Reports. You might know Consumer Reports for the fact that we do car testing and vacuum testing and washing machine testing all independently. We also have a consumer protection policy division, and that is where I sit. And I'm going to be talking about surveillance pricing. So what is surveillance pricing? Surveillance pricing is when companies use personal data about consumers, like, for example, their age, their gender, their search history, inferences about their family size or income or sexual orientation, maybe interests, maybe their geolocation, to show them a different price for a good or service. And this is something that a lot of consumers have, for a while kind of wondered whether or not it's happening or have suspected it's happening. You might have the experience of searching around online for something, seeing one price for a good, and then doing some more research, and then later seeing another price for that. And it's like, is that because they knew my search history? Or, you and your friend might look for something at the same time and see different prices. So this is an issue that consumers for a while have had an intuitive sense or kind of a rational paranoia about. But in recent years, we've seen more and more examples of it happening in the market. So I'm going to talk through some of those examples because I think they're the best way to color in what we're seeing. So a lot of the examples come from investigative journalism because it takes kind of a controlled experiment to figure out, okay, what could be influencing the price that I'm seeing when prices are different. And there was a pretty clever experiment done by a reporter for a San Francisco publication who changed various ways he was looking for hotels, specifically hotels in New York City on a specific night. He changed things like his browser, the type of device he was using, and he also changed the location that it looked like his computer was searching from. So, he ran some searches that appeared to be coming from a Bay Area laptop, and he also simulated searches coming from, Phoenix, a Phoenix laptop, and I think one from Kansas City, and found that for the same hotel room on the same night in New York City, people searching from the Bay Area would have seen prices as much as $500 per night higher. What's going on here? What exactly is the company thinking with this pricing difference? We don't know for sure, but you could imagine an inference is being made that consumers in the Bay Area have more money to spend on hotels. Another example, and this is an example from a Minnesota investigative journalism outlet, found that Target was showing different prices on its app based on kind of precisely where your phone was if you were on the app. Specifically, if you were kind of on the far side of the parking lot at Target or further away from the store, you'd see one set of prices for a bundle of products. And once you passed into the store, if you were still looking at the app, you might see some significantly higher prices. So for example, a Graco car seat was $72 more expensive in the store when looking at the app. So Target seemed to be changing prices based on the geolocation of your phone. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip over this, but one final example, this just came out earlier this week, and this is an investigation CR was involved in along with our partner Groundwork Collaborative, found that Instacart was testing out different prices for the same goods at the same time in the same stores for different consumers. So consumers were seeing as many as 5 different prices for the same products. The prices diverged by as much as 23% for the same product. And it's not clear from the evidence that Consumer Reports investigators observed that there was any correlation with observable consumer traits such as demographic data. So we don't have a clear nexus with personal data. This might have been a random test, and that is in fact, I believe, what Instacart told our investigative team, but still consumers seeing different prices for the same product at the same time. Harms, briefly, particularly of interest to this kind of competition-focused crowd. When different consumers are seeing different prices, it actually makes it a little bit harder to comparison shop, because common ways that consumers comparison shop or make it easier to comparison shop is looking at third-party roundups of good prices or hearing word of mouth from friends and family about where they found a good deal. And if everyone's seeing different prices, those 2 strategies for comparison shopping go out the window. And comparison shopping is actually really important for a competitive market because a key motivator for businesses to compete on price is the knowledge that consumers are looking for the best price. It's also harder for smaller businesses to compete with large retailers once large retailers start doing this, because larger retailers like Amazon, for example, have really vast quantities of consumer data. They know a lot about their consumers. Large retailers often are also buying consumer data from third-party brokers. And this is a less common practice among really small businesses, but it's that data that enables this sort of surveillance pricing. Lastly, what are we seeing policymakers do in response? Many policymakers are pursuing a prohibition, just saying you can't do this, you can't use someone's personal data to change the price they're seeing. We've seen this in a handful of states. I've cited a couple here. We're also seeing several bills in Congress. I'll add that we saw one law pass this year in New York that went a different route in terms of a policy choice that required companies to disclose when they're doing personalized pricing with just kind of one generic disclosure. It's something like this price was informed by your personal data or something along those lines. And at Consumer Reports, we believe that's not probably the most helpful policy response because it's not very actionable information for consumers. They don't know, did the price they see, has it gone up or has it gone down? What information about them was the information that informed the price? It's kind of hard to know what to do with that sort of disclosure. So we think a prohibition is probably the better way to go. And I will turn it back to you, Justin.
Great, thank you so much for that, Grace. Got a good suggestion to remind folks that if you want to ask a question, use the Q&A feature to do that. We'll move into to questions, and I want to start with Ron. You may have seen this question in the chat from Lance about sort of a really good, but longer question, so I won't read the whole thing, but sort of about the way that enforcing price discrimination may change prices for different folks in the supply chain.
Sure, happy to talk about that. I mean, I'll say it's a good question. It's an important question, I'll say a few things and address it in a couple of different ways. One, the Robinson-Patman Act is not about raising prices for like the Walmarts of the world. That's not the intent of it, and that's not really what happens in practice, right? The idea is that there's going to be fairness and there's going to be the same prices everywhere. So whenever there's been a private Robinson-Patman Act suit, I was talking to Cheryl Sussman. He's a lawyer, works at in a private law firm, used to work at the FTC. He's done a lot of Robinson-Patman Act work in cases. And what happens when you actually bring a successful Robinson-Patman Act cases is that the smaller retail ends up getting the same discount as the larger retailer. So it's not necessarily about raising the prices at Walmart. It's about making sure the smaller retailers can get those same negotiated discounts in the same way on that kind of level playing field. What can't happen under Robinson-Patman, and the language of the law is that a retailer cannot knowingly induce a supplier to giving it an unfair discount. That doesn't mean that the Walmarts of the world or the Krogers of the world can't negotiate. It just means that you can't push a supplier's bottom line down so far that they're not meeting their costs, so they have to raise prices to all the smaller retailers or the regional chains. That's what you cannot do under the law. So it's trying to avoid that. But again, the idea is to ensure a level playing field. The idea is to ensure that you maintain the ability for the smaller retailers, the mom and pop shops, to exist and to survive and to thrive. And when you do that, you create robust competition, and that robust competition has always been the way that you actually keep the prices down and you actually serve the consumers better, right? That price competition between lots of different stores is the thing that's going to make the groceries affordable to folks, including the most vulnerable folks in communities. I'll also just point out that the Walmart's profits were up more than 30% year on year between 2023 and 2024. Walmart's not they're just, they're using their power to do this bullying. They're not necessarily passing on all those savings to the customers. That's 100% not what they're doing. This is a massive, extraordinarily profitable retailer. I'll just remind everyone that profits are, the amount that you that you don't pay workers and the amount that you overcharge your customers. That's what's actually happening here. So I'm not too worried about the Walmarts of the world if they can't bully their way to these discounts that they get now. The competition is what's going to keep the prices down and is going to actually make the grocery market work for everybody, including the most vulnerable customers in different communities.
Thank you, Ron. There's a couple of good questions here from Daniel. I'll take a couple of these. The first was what happened with the Consumer Grocery Pricing Fairness Act and the Fair Competition Act in the Minnesota House. So both bills are still alive and well heading into to next session. The Consumer Grocery Pricing Fairness Act did receive a informational hearing in the House Commerce Committee that I thought was a really powerful, impactful discussion, and we continue to. It's also a bipartisan bill in the House. We want to work to make that a bipartisan bill in the Senate as well, and remains a priority for MFU. Fair Competition Act didn't get action, but remains a priority for us. We've also worked alongside the Attorney General's office and others on that bill, and we'll continue pushing. Another question from Daniel was, does the same kind of supplier discrimination with grocery stores happen in other markets? Ron, others, if you have stuff to add, but I would say yes, this is sort of a broad problem, particularly across retail. It's something that as MFU has been holding roundtables with small business owners around the state, is something that we've heard in those initial roundtables from small retailers that, they don't necessarily always use the term price discrimination, but the stories that they're telling are clearly that same sort of problem. And then a question maybe for Grace is there evidence of Amazon conducting surveillance pricing?
That's a great question. I think they might have, and Pat, do you remember the example of them experimenting with this back in like 2011 or 2001? Do you want to pipe up about that?
I don't remember all the details, but there was definitely, I think, a Wall Street Journal report of them at least messing with various tools regarding pricing and kind of getting into what I was talking about on the coercion, ensuring that the sellers that were on their platform were adopting similar prices and not directly undercutting each other. But I don't remember the exact details. And there actually have been several antitrust cases that are all still in the pipeline, to Zephyr's point about how long these cases take. They were filed years ago, going at Amazon's ability to raise prices across its platform and use its power.
Yeah, and I welcome any of I know probably my co-panelists also have insights on this particular question. So I think I recall there being an early example, but years ago, and based on consumer outrage, frankly, it was walked back. But I'll have to double check the details of that. It is an area though that, of course, like the sort of investigative journalism and often like participatory science is needed to figure out what's happening with prices. So you can have hundreds of people looking at the exact same time. And I think, that Amazon would be a great place to do that kind of check, because they certainly have the sophisticated technology and the data.
And I'm sorry, I jumped out. Somebody already said this, but the mechanism for surveillance pricing can be through things like coupons, things that sort of seem innocuous. And also through the sorting of what kinds of deals you get. So there's the sort of crude form of surveillance pricing where, like, I find out that you're getting a divorce, so I charge you more for cookies. And then there is the sophisticated form of that same kind of surveillance pricing, which gives other people discounts and sort of coupons for being a good shopper, but doesn't give the stressed out divorcee that same coupon.
I can speak a little bit to both questions, I think. To the first question about whether you see the same kind of price discrimination in other industries, As Justin said, yes, of course. I mean, I think the two examples that come to my mind are pharmacies. Like pharmacy deserts are just as prevalent right now as food deserts for much the same reasons. Pharmacies experience price discrimination really on all sides of their business. They experience price discrimination from the pharmacy benefit managers, these kind of predatory middlemen that can charge smaller independent pharmacies far more, or actually reimburse them far less than the amount of money that they give to the big chains. And pharmacies also sell all kinds of stuff on their shelves, over the counter medicine, makeup, whatever it might be, and they experience price discrimination on those things as well. And then books, right? Like Amazon essentially demands that publishers give it a massive, massive discount on the books that it sells. That's how Amazon maintains its monopoly in book sales, whereas your small local book shop down the street cannot demand and has to just charge the price that's on the cover of the book. So kind of a cut and dry case of price discrimination there. And then the second question, we just did a really robust investigation using a lot of public data of Amazon's power in public procurement. Amazon right now is a huge supplier of all kinds of things to government, from your local city to your school districts and so on. And I don't know if it's necessarily this kind of surveillance pricing, but there's certainly dynamic pricing that's happening, where one district is paying a completely different price for one school district, let's say, a completely different price than another school district for the exact same product purchased on the exact same day. There's really there's no reason that these prices are so vastly different. And I'm talking about $10 compared to $80, right? There's no reason that this is happening, other than there's something baked into the algorithm. We can't see it and really know, I don't have the insight to know what it is, but there's something baked into this dynamic pricing thing, that Amazon is doing as a matter of practice. So I would suspect there's some level of surveillance pricing happening.
I think there's a really important point there, is that the line between dynamic pricing and surveillance pricing can get a little blurry sometimes. And when you get to the point where dynamic pricing is so pumped up on steroids that you're functionally doing surveillance pricing without calling that, you're so segmenting the population on your dynamic pricing into such small groups that it is, for all intents and purposes, personalized, even if there are, 2 or 3 other people in the group with you. So I think a challenge for the policies here is to ensure that we're getting at all of these tactics.
Great. Thank you all. We are at time. I know there are some really good unanswered or maybe partially answered questions in here from Jason and Lance. I see your follow-up, and Dan, I see, and Paul. We'll follow up on those questions via email. I'll also plan to, all of these great panelists here have they and or the organizations they work for have all sorts of incredible resources that we can share on these different issues in a follow-up email, probably some of their contact information as well. And again, we'll get to those. I want folks to know we'll get to those questions. So apologies that we sort of ran out of time, but this was such a great discussion, incredible presentations. We covered a whole lot of ground here today, and excited to continue working with all of the presenters, and then obviously everyone that attended. So I appreciate everyone's time, and we'll follow up soon. Thanks so much.